The global economy is experiencing a sharper than expected slowdown, with the highest inflation levels seen in decades. And the energy crisis brought on by the war in Ukraine, which worsened food insecurity crisis and cost of living crisis, all with the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. And although Indonesia fared better than most other countries this year, there were still challenges faced by the country. According to the IMF, the global economy grew 6% in 2021, but is expected to drop to a staggering 3.2% in 2022, and to lower further to 2.7% in 2023. Moreover, global inflation rose in 2022 from 4.7% in 2021 to 8.8% in 2022. The war in Ukraine brought on a global energy crisis in 2022, and the effects of the energy crisis went beyond the economical aspect, becoming a humanitarian crisis. This winter, people all across Europe are struggling to heat their homes. The volatile energy market caused by the war has damaged the global economy. In energy importing economies, higher prices will reduce real disposable income, which in turn will raise production costs, tighten financial conditions, and heighten interest rates. Energy importing economies like the United Kingdom was hit hard by the war in Ukraine, when their economy is still reeling from the slowdowns brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. The UK's long-running account deficit has been exacerbated by soaring energy prices. Inflation hit a 40-year high of 10.1% in September. And the controversial and disastrous policy by shortest-serving Prime Minister Liz Truss, the pound crashed on September 26, 2022, falling nearly 5% to a record low against the US dollars of just above 1.03. War in Ukraine has also led to significant increases in agriculture commodity prices, exacerbating food insecurity globally, and extreme poverty in many emerging markets and developing economies. Ukraine is a leading exporter of grain. Around 90% of Ukraine's agricultural export were seaborne, and the blockade of the Black Sea ports by the Russian forces essentially stopped the exports and brought Ukraine's exports to a virtual standstill earlier this year. The EU intervened and Russia agreed to stop the blockade of the Black Sea, which saw exports increasing. But the situation still contributed to a sharp food price increase globally. Even with situation slightly improving in the second half of 2022, prices are still significantly higher than that of 2021. And with inflation at an all-time high, people are struggling to make ends meet, especially in emerging economies, which worsened the food insecurity crisis. High inflation meant that central banks around the world had to intervene and tighten monetary policy, such as the U.S. Federal Reserve, which hiked its benchmark interest rates to its highest level in 15 years. This caused the dollar to strengthen and put pressure on other currencies, with the rupiah and Chinese yuan depreciating over 8% and the Indian rupee by over 10%. Nevertheless, amid high inflation sparked by a global energy and food crisis, Indonesia's economy in 2022 still fared better than most other countries, with an impressive growth rate of 5.72% year-on-year in the third quarter of 2022. And according to reports by the Asian Development Bank released in September, Indonesia's economy is expected to grow by 5% in 2023, with inflation projected to remain elevated in 2023 as well. But still, inflation in Indonesia rose in 2022 because of higher commodity prices and the recent fuel price increases. Indonesia, like many other countries, had its fair share of impacts from the global economical conditions, as it led to a 30% increase in subsidized fuel prices in the month of September. So the Indonesian government said that they have no choice but to raise subsidized fuel prices because the burden on the state budget is too high. But do you think there are other ways to cut spending and budget? For example, on government's operational costs?
So, and also subsidy. I think it's very huge. And don't forget that even with the current new price on fuel, we still allocate a lot of amount of money to energy subsidy. So, for instance, additional subsidy, if we calculate from the original state budget, is around 350 trillion. So it's large. Now, if we compare with infrastructure budget, the overall infrastructure budget, the infrastructure budget is around 380 trillion. So the additional, subsidy, even after we increase the price, is around 90% of infrastructure budget. So I think the only choice, I think I agree with the government, the only choice for the government is to increase fuel price.
Indonesia's subsidized fuel price hike was the first in 8 years, but it was the country's last option, as Indonesia's energy subsidy had tripled in 2022 to 502 trillion rupiah, or equivalent to $34 billion from the original budget, which was triggered by the rising global oil and gas price.
This 147 trillion is not, I think the government will not cover this, this sort from other sources, because, other spendings are already tight. We are committed, for instance, that you mentioned about the infrastructure. I think the government will delay the payment, this 147 trillion to the Pertamina. So this is basically like the government debt. So the payment will be made around 2023 state budget. So this is kind of the government debt to Pertamina.
Fuel prices are a sensitive issue in Indonesia, as the government has subsidized fuel for decades. The increase in fuel prices could trigger price hikes of other goods, including food commodities. But the Indonesian government still managed to subsidize transport costs for motorcycle taxis, drivers, and fishermen in particular, to help ease the burden of the increase on the population. The rising price of fertilizers globally due to the conflict in Ukraine has brought prices back to the levels of the 2008 and 2009 crisis. It peaked an increase of 27% in April this year. The prices of food commodities in Indonesia recorded significant increases compared to 2021, with food like chicken eggs, chili peppers, wheat, and cooking oil increasing, which has put a strain on household purchasing power in the country. These shocks, mainly the disruption to the global energy market, became a catalyst for policies to find substitute to other fuels and developing new sources of energy supplies, which accelerated the push for green energy. Indonesia went on to host 2022's G20 summit, and one of the 3 priority issues of the summit was the development of green energy. The research and innovation gathering side events of the G20 focused on increasing and strengthening research collaboration between G20 members through sharing resources. Among other targets, Indonesia aims to create 1.8 million green jobs, according to index released by the National Development Planning Agency. The side event emphasized the urgency to transform economies to a greener and more sustainable future. The National Development Planning Agency, or Bappenas, released a study in 2021 that showed how implementation of climate resilience development policy in 4 priority sectors can reduce potential economic loss by about 48.3%. Although Indonesia has its fair share of economic challenges this year, it still fared better than most other countries, with inflation levels at one of the lowest in the world, and a growth level of 5.7% and a projected growth of over 5% next year. Indonesia remains resilient in the face of crises.